Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Will, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we were at the AIER mansion last weekend, I think.
Yes.
And we discussed the possibility of having a conversation about foreign policy and realism, and you bringing your expertise to the table. So I'm glad that we found a time when you're in D.C.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. It's going to be, I think, a fun conversation.
And I just saw this Lex Friedman conversation that went on for 7 hours. So I thought we'd go for 8 or 9. We'll see.
Absolutely. I want to break any record like that.
I don't know how a human does that, but
Well, I will tell you, I used to teach 3-hour-long graduate classes, and if the students didn't warn me about the need for a break, I could keep going.
Yeah.
Fortunately, my teaching evaluations were decent, so it wasn't as if I was oblivious.
So they liked the 3 hours.
I guess.
Or they paid for it, so they had to.
Well, we would hope
slog
there would
through
be
it.
some consumerism still in higher ed, that they
Yeah.
actually wanted what they're paid for, what they were paying for.
So that's actually like give people a sense for. So you became the president of the American Institute for Economic Research in March?
January
January.
of this year. Yep.
Okay, so
a
you're-
little less than a year.
Yeah. And you were an academic, and you served in the Navy, and you fought in Afghanistan. Give us a little bit of your history.
Sure. A big part of it is that I was an academic for most of my career. Taught at a variety of places like people usually do in the academic market, but ultimately landed at Texas State University, where I received tenure. Taught the suite of international relations courses, including courses on U.S. foreign policy, security studies, ethics, and international relations. But I also taught a specialty course up at UT Austin at the LBJ School on terrorism and counterterrorism, which was apropos given my experience in uniform, including in Afghanistan, but also, my civilian expertise. So it was a good marriage. But then about 8 years ago, I was recruited to come work here in D.C., which was a hard decision since I loved being an academic, but worked out really well. I loved coming up here. And I've done a lot of work helping try to institutionalize realism and restraint here in Washington, to build the ideas and help support the people and institutions that I think need to challenge the blobby status quo foreign policy establishment. And you want to talk about a dead consensus.
Yeah.
That's the one we should be focused on, not fusionism, but the kind of foreign policy primacist establishment.
We've had Kelly Vlahos on the show, and she calls it the blob.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think I sometimes worry about using that term because I am sensitive to the idea that we want to be respectful of our intellectual adversaries.
Yeah.
And it drives me crazy when people use the I word to describe what is really a long tradition of realism and restraint that goes all the way back to the founders. And clearly, isolationism is a slander, right? It's a pejorative only used by people who oppose, having a broader conversation about what America's role in the world should be. And people who subscribe to realism and restraint aren't talking about disengaging from the world, sticking their head in the sand, or isolating ourselves. It's just about being more prudential in how we go about securing ourselves and advancing America's national interests. And I think the fact that they've had to use the I word so often is because of the fact that they don't want to necessarily have to have the conversation about basic assumptions and so forth, especially because, it's like in any intellectual or political movement, right? A lot of people subscribe to the bromides and mutter the chants like they're at church, but
right.
you start poking holes in some of those things, and quickly it falls apart. And so a lot of people just resort to those slanders. But I try to stay away from it. Again, I start with, talk about the blob. But really, it's a primacist approach to grand strategy in American foreign policy. And that could be either good or bad. I think primacy or liberal, hegemonialism is another word that's used in the academic literature on this. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But, the basic, premises of what we've been doing over the last 20 to 30 years is what Washington subscribes to. And there is a To their credit, for I wish that Restraint had such a deep bench of scholars and people subscribing to a particular worldview, but that's what we have here in Washington. The problem is that it actually is not working at making us safer or more secure or more prosperous. And so that's why we challenge it, not because it's necessarily the establishment. I liked when we had a free trade establishment, and there were lots of people whose depth of knowledge about free trade was pretty thin, but at least they were saying the right chants. Now we're seeing even challenges to that. So again, it's not that there is an establishment per se that's bad. It's that the establishment is wrong for the American people.
Yeah, and there's as a student of public choice economics, the incentives are all aligned where, I suppose this is a pejorative, but I love to use the phrase military-industrial complex, and it's an economy of interests that align, that always find them supporting the next big war, and it gets into the critique of nation building. And I think about it as an economist, and specifically a Hayekian economist. There's a fatal conceit and a sense that you can sort of centrally plan based on some goal, some ideal, how the rest of the world is going to govern itself and live its life.
Yeah, the sense that you could actually order the world as you see fit.
Yeah.
And again, I think that is an important part of the critique that comes from realism and restraint. One thing I'd be hesitant to do is to ascribe the kind of pecuniary interest to most of the people who actually subscribe to the establishment's view of primacy. I think it's a mix, right? There are some people where they believe all good things go together. They happen to be getting wealthy as part of the military-industrial complex, or they get prestige jobs, things like that. But it also goes along with what they believe is necessary to secure the United States or a broader set of interests that they believe in. It's just awfully, it's awful nice that it fits together so well, though, right? And sometimes you want to question whether that's the case. But there are others, for example, that it's not as kind of a simple public choice story. It's more of in some ways a kind of constructivist story about the power of ideas. And ultimately that's also a very, I think, classical liberal view, the notion that ideas matter. They don't always win. Classical liberals can certainly tell people that, right? Sometimes when they go against the forces of entrenched interests and structural challenges, the best ideas don't always win. But the fact is, there are people who honestly hold these ideas, and I think we should be generous in that way, because they should also be generous. We would want them to have the same kind of generosity to say, like, look, people who disagree with their views about Ukraine, it doesn't mean that people are carrying water for people we find loathsome. It's just that we don't think that these are necessary for the United States to pursue. And oftentimes nowadays you just see a lot of shouting. People like Rand Paul, Senator Paul, have suffered these slings and arrows that are really quite unfair.
Right.
It's also a bizarre world when people can claim that people who are saying we need to do what's best for America, they're the ones people are calling traitors.
Right.
That's bizarre, right? Because you don't want to support XYZ country and everything that they want to do and write a blank check for them.
Yeah.
So again, I think we're being, probably even starting a little too defensive, because look, realism and restraint is a very positive argument for what's necessary for us to do, and also a realistic one. It is consistent with the nature of the international system. And for those of us who are classical liberal in our kind of general political philosophy, realism is also consistent with that type of worldview, as long as you don't push it too far, right? Realism and anarcho-capitalism are not consistent, but realism and a proper classical liberalism are, and we saw that in the founders, many of the founders, and in the 100 years after the founding, in terms of what guided a largely classical liberal polity.
Would you call George Washington and his famous warning against entangling alliances, is this a realist point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly because, and this may give some classical liberals pause, those who celebrate like Aaron Burr's birthday or something, which is that
those guys.
Yeah, those guys. Which is that it's Hamilton has a role to play in the writing of the farewell address that you reference. But President Washington is ultimately responsible for it. He delivers it, right? But it's a fantastic, I think,
the one thing that Hamilton did right. I'll even concede that.
Yeah, but it's a great encapsulation of of a realist view that is compatible with our, essentially classical liberal worldview as a whole, right?
Yeah.
And I think a big part of it is that, look, in this worldview, the state has a proper role to play, right? The state should be limited. It should have a very narrow set of jobs that it is meant to do, which is largely protecting the property rights of Americans and our collective, territorial integrity. And it needs to do that well.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means and how you pursue that is going to be different depending a lot on the context. And this is where I would be different than some others probably that are allies, in that I don't identify as a non-interventionist or as anti-war. I identify as being a realist and a restrainer, but a big part of that restraint comes from the fact that the environmental conditions and how we would define the national interests mean that we can be restrained, and in many ways we can be against interventions because of the particular context of our day. And so I would say that realism would not tell us that we should always be restrained in our approach to foreign policy, unless restraint just means prudentialism, which of course it should always be. But if restraint means something more, it means like a commitment like Washington to avoiding the type of entangling alliances. Now, again, he didn't use that term, it's Jefferson, but the kind of those alliances that aren't consistent, that are permanent, we should you may counsel that. And you may counsel the other kind of pillar of kind of Washington's great rule, if you will, of a kind of reticence to intervene, particularly back then in the old world contest, but it was grounded in this notion that that's not good for the United States, particularly in the moment they were in. And I think that there are some moments in which a different approach to grand strategy would be necessary to secure the state, even a classical liberal state. Now, there are some foreign policies or grand strategies that simply would be incompatible with classical liberalism, period. So for example, there are some means that would simply be inconsistent, and we would be loath to adopt them. Now, one thing we've understood from some of the academic literature on some of those means is that they don't work either. So that's kind of nice that kind of all good things go together, although we should be very careful when that's the case. But in the case of like strategic bombing or quote unquote strategic bombing, or in the case of terrorism, when you're specifically targeting innocent civilian non-combatants, those don't tend to actually work. So there's a lot of academic literature on how strategic bombing fails, and also how terrorism, defined the way I just did, that also fails at meeting your ultimate ends. But those would be inconsistent, I think, with a classical liberal approach. But back to kind of realism and restraint. I mean, one of the reasons why it was important at the founding to adopt that is because of America's particular geostrategic position at the time. The fact that it was very difficult for European powers to project power successfully here in the Americas. And also, for most of that period, the British Navy, the British government's interests and ours were coterminous when it came to keeping out other European powers from the New World. And so it came together in a nice way. And look, the fact is that worked for America for a long time. Mm-hmm. Now, I would not say, for example, that one should be against having alliances at any time and any place. We needed the alliance with France at the beginning of our country's history. It would have been hard to imagine us defeating the British, or at least as quickly in the way we did, without them. But Washington was also smart enough to know that alliances are means to ends. And unfortunately, people like Biden talk about sacred alliances, making it theological and therefore a sin if you violate it. Whereas Washington threw over the French alliance almost as quickly as our country gained its independence. I mean, you see in the 1790s where we are very quickly jettisoned that commitment. In fact, there were lots of people that were arguing against this, saying, look, we have to keep this commitment. We have to support the French. But Washington and Hamilton prudently resisted that and set us on a course that was quite different than one in which we would be intervening and taking sides in European affairs. And there's a lot of great counsel to Washington, Washington's farewell, talking about it like, don't get too permanently in love with any country, but also don't have enmity that's so deeply interwoven that you can't think rationally.
Yeah.
And our foreign policy is almost the opposite today, right? Where we have these deep-seated attachments and special relationships, sacred commitments. And then we have the other countries that seem to be permanent enemies, regardless of how the international system changes. And that's just not a wise approach, right? You have to be flexible and prudent in foreign policy, particularly because of the fact that the nature of the threat environment and the nature of the strategic environment changes. And I think that the success of a country is being able to, to pivot in a way that's prudential to, again, in the service of protecting our country here at home. And so you could argue that, during World War II, we aligned ourselves with Uncle Joe Stalin, obviously a very bad guy. And if you want to do the kind of Manichaean good guy, bad guy, seems to fit pretty well when it comes to that era. And but as opposed to being, kind of overly idealistic about it, the alliance with the temporary alliance with the Soviet Union allowed us to defeat what we considered to be a much more dangerous strategic adversary in Hitler's Nazi Germany. But again, we very quickly pivoted out of that, mostly because the nature of the international system changed, right? And then we helped set up an alliance system that at that time made sense. But the idea that what was set up in the late 1940s and 1950s is something that has to continue for all time, regardless of changes in the nature of the international environment, would be the opposite of a kind of realistic approach, the opposite of Washington's counsel against permanent peacetime alliances. And that's why I think that we ought to hearken back to some of those guys like George Washington, John Quincy Adams, who has a fantastic essay or address he gave on July 4th, 1821, not far from here. These are great counsels, and they aren't just time-specific in one sense, but it doesn't, again, mean that we want to be slavish towards that counsel when you need to, right? So,
right.
And that's why I think a big part, you talked about kind of my past a little bit at the beginning. I graduated from college, or went to college and graduated from college as the world was changing quite dramatically. And I'm sitting in an intro to IR class in the fall of 1989, and the world is changing, in that period I'm in college. And, I think the smart thing for America to do, at least it was smart for me, I thought, was to, hey, let's think about how this changed world should affect how we think about America's role in it. And instead, after the Cold War, we didn't shift in the way that we could have. In some ways, we put our approach on steroids. And as we knew more about what that post-Cold War world was going to look like, American foreign policy, I don't think, adapted to this changed environment. And so even if you thought, that, look, the Cold War demanded a system of alliances, a large permanent, standing army, and a far-flung set of bases and commitments around the world, that 1989, 1991, that period should have caused us to have a reassessment. And it didn't in some ways and did in others. The way it did is that people thought, well, look, now we're the unipolar power. We could actually, in a way, try to, create heaven on earth, right? We could have like the responsibility to protect document. We could go against rogue nations. We could try to end terrorism, right? The global war on terror, right? It's not against Al-Qaeda, it's against terrorism as a means, right? These types of things were, I think that in a way, our unipolarity short-circuited our brains. And so we stopped thinking as prudentially, in some ways because the costs of making mistakes were less in a historic sense, even though they became grave for us. 7,000 Americans die, over 58,000 are wounded, almost 1 million benefits claims from the global war on terror era. Those are real costs, and we spend trillions, right?
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with Blaze TV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. I still think there's a public choice, or maybe I'll just invoke Ronald Reagan. I realize that there are substantial philosophical belief sets that drive foreign policy, just like economic policy or the role of government. But, I'll butcher Ronald Reagan, but he said there's nothing so permanent as a government program.
Right.
And to unwind the apparatus of the Cold War was probably practically difficult, if not impossible, simply because you had all of those interests and all of that money flowing in that direction. So they're like, what do we do with these tools?
Right.
We're seeing this happen on COVID right now, by the way.
Right.
Is all of these tools that we use to foolishly and tragically lock down the economy and all that. The Biden administration has now released a vision for the future that just doubles down on all that apparatus. And I feel like with foreign policy, like if we have these toys, we're going to use them. And if we don't have a legitimate reason to use them, we're going to use them anyway, and we're going to find a way.
Yeah, and I think that's
and by the way, I'm probably more of a non-interventionist, although I'm a little schizophrenic about it, because my non-interventionism is almost always defended with practical arguments about what can't work when it comes to these more grandiose neoconservative nation-building arguments. There's a very clear, demonstrable proof that these ideas don't work in practice and they make America less safe.
Yeah. But again, I think for American realists and restrainers, right, and we can go into this a little bit more, non-interventionism and that look very similar because there are very few cases where a realist in America, in this context we're in, would advocate for intervention.
Yeah.
But if you were a Prussian in the 1860s, as a realist, you might counsel something very differently because of the nature of the threat environment, right? You're on the North European plain. You have, big states on all sides of you, and you may need to have alliances. You may need to do things like fight the war in 1864 and 1866 and 1870, right? Those may be necessary to secure yourself in that dangerous environment, or at least you wouldn't rule that out, right, on prudential grounds. And that's very different than, say, being an American. So one of the reasons why we should practice restraint today, a functionally anti-interventionism today, is because of the kind of fundamental realities and constraints of the international system. So let me kind of roll through those a bit. And this is why I have no fight with anti-interventionists when it comes to America today. And so it's a somewhat academic argument because, look, one of the great disservices to the American conversation on America's role in the world is this notion that the world is, smaller and that these boundaries and these things like the oceans don't matter as much. They still matter a lot, right? We have two big moats between us and the rest of the world. That is a substantial thing. And yeah, the world is smaller in some ways, but try moving men and material across vast distances, especially water, because it's very difficult to conceal yourself, right, on the surface of the ocean. It's hard to project power across large bodies of water. This is something that John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago talks about. He talks about the stopping power of water. Well, in some ways, it's the stopping power of the water, but as other people have said, it's the stopping power of navies, right? So if the Chinese are going to do the million-man swim, right, they're going to do the Chinese Armada, how do they get from there to here, right? Even leaving aside nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, like imagine they actually want to invade. It's like Red Dawn 2, right? They want to take over the Americas using physical power, just like we've seen historically for centuries, right? How do they get all the men and material across that body of water? Right, if you have a strong navy, you have a strong subsurface fleet, you have air power, you could be hitting those things like ducks on a pond. And it makes it very difficult to do that. That still matters. It's easier for, say, China to fight against Vietnam than it would be to fight us over here. It's just really hard. So projection power is hard. 2, nuclear weapons. Right? This is a major change in the nature of international politics. And in some ways, I'm not even sure we've reconciled it because, in effect, it almost obviates some of the traditional geostrategic concerns about the balance of power. right? So imagine if one power could amalgamate a lot of power in Eurasia, which has been a traditional American worry. There's still the question of how they actually could harm America's territorial integrity, because as long as you meet the criteria for nuclear deterrence, it makes it extremely risky for anyone to test that. And as long as you have the gumption to actually make the threat and have the capability and be willing to carry it out, other states are going to think twice. So that puts a lot less pressure on us, because that nuclear, it basically guarantees our territorial integrity. So why do we have to be fighting abroad in many cases, like states have historically, if your territorial integrity is essentially assured? And then even if we just forgot about the nuclear revolution mattering, the fact is that we have the world's strongest army, we have the world's strongest navy, we have a strong air force, and the Marines and the Navy have air power that's quite impressive. So our conventional forces are also highly valuable to deter and defend, and would make other countries think twice. And then you add into that things like the fact that the Eurasian balance of power that we've traditionally been concerned about is fractured. The idea, for example, especially after this experience in Ukraine, that Russia could take over Western Europe, amalgamate all that power, and that put pressure on the Americas is absurd. They couldn't even project power, all the way to Kiev, let alone to Berlin, Paris, the UK, and then the shores of, Long Island. It's absurd, isn't it? And then when you think about the fact that, China and Russia would have to bandwagon together when they have natural reasons to want to balance each other.
Yeah.
And the difficulty that China would have escaping the first island chain, let alone having to deal with Russia and its backdoor. I mean, again, the balance of power is pretty robust. And what that means fundamentally is that the United States is a lot safer than you would think if you're reading the op-ed pages of your newspaper that's basically, like Chicken Little, always worried that the sky is falling. We're a lot safer. Now, I think that where your head probably goes is, well, if the reality of the world is that we're a lot safer than we say, then there must be entrenched interests that are pushing this threat inflation. And I would say, sure, I think there are some. Not only here at home, but actually abroad, right? There are foreign countries that are trying to play in the American domestic political scene to promote the idea that the United States needs to be abroad. It makes sense. It's rational. Why wouldn't they, right? Why wouldn't Germany want a free ride on American taxpayers, right? It makes a lot of sense from their perspective. They're almost practicing a higher realism than we are here, right? So
they're pretty much free riding on this, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. But again, back to the ideas. A big part of it isn't necessarily the pecuniary interests. It's that people have convinced themselves about a set of assumptions about the need for the United States to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Either because this notion that we're not safe unless the rest of the world is democratic, or we're not safe because there's always someone out there that would do us harm and could easily do it. But regardless, this set of assumptions leads many people without a pecuniary interest to believe that we're not as safe as we actually are. But the reality is that there's just massive threat inflation for whatever reason, massive threat inflation out there. And again, I'm a realist. I think power matters. I think that the anarchic nature of the international system means that you always have to be wary for your security. Why I believe you have to have a strong military. Does it need to be at the levels we're at now, $800+ billion a year? No, but we should have a strong military, especially when it comes to nuclear power, naval power. But do we need to be doing all the stuff that we're doing around the world in order to make us safe? Absolutely not. Think about Syria. It just does not matter who's running Syria. It is not going to affect the United States. And even in the case of ISIS, which again, completely fair for actors in the region to want to whack ISIS. But the fact is they have their own incentives to do that, whether it's the Kurds, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Iranians, right? There are a lot of actors that have an interest in doing that. And the United States should want to buck pass more. And this goes kind of your German question, right? The Germans want to pass the buck on trying to provide for German security. It makes sense in a lot of ways. And so do other countries. Well, why are we going to be Uncle Sucker, right? Why aren't we adopting a policy that's more look, Calvin Coolidge said that if you have 10 problems coming down the road, 9 of them are going to be in the ditch before you get there. Have an approach like that in foreign policy where, look, if the biggest problem in the world is, say, Serbia, like some claimed it was in the 90s, Let Germany and France and Italy and other regional actors handle that. Now, when Serbia is a threat to the Eurasian balance of power, then pick up the phone and call 911. But that call's never coming.
Yeah. So I'm gonna float a theory that I have that's half baked, and you're a realist, and I'm a libertarian non-interventionist who focuses primarily on economic policy,
Right,
and economic freedom, and all of the benefits that come from that. This past summer, Terry, my wife, and I were speaking throughout Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc countries primarily, and of course, as the American, they're like, "What are you going to do to help me?" As friends, not as, because I don't represent the government, hopefully. And my argument to them was that the best thing you can do is become very free and very strong and grow the hell out of your economy. And please, God, develop enough resources that you aren't completely unilaterally disarmed when it comes to energy policy.
Or any type of thing, right?
Anything.
So for example, making yourself a porcupine is underrated as an approach to international relations, but it also means trying not to become too dependent on other states. Now, that for classical liberals, that can cut both ways, right? Because one of the advantages of the international economy is that you can specialize. And you can take advantage of comparative advantage, and so if you have a system in which you specialize, that could make you dependent on others, and that can be dangerous, right? So this is one reason why, while generally classical liberals should be completely in favor of free trade, and realists should, I think, also be very friendly to free trade because it makes us richer, and ultimately being richer allows us to be more stronger, and more secure. There are some things in which you don't want to become dependent on others on, and even Adam Smith recognized this. So it's not a violation of like the kind of gods of classical liberalism,
or at least diversify. And I'm thinking specifically of energy, and I didn't know this until we spoke this summer, but Europe has, through the European Union, has effectively implemented something called the Green Deal, which is almost exactly like what we call the Green New Deal. And, there's evidence that Putin himself was financing anti-fracking interests in the UK. So for whatever reason, Europe, starting with old Europe, countries like Germany, have basically eliminated their ability to either produce or import energy from multiple sources, particularly fossil fuels. And to me, that I would argue that almost finances Putin. It gives him the resources he needs, and not a monopoly, but a market position in terms of gas and oil.
It can create dangerous dependencies.
Yeah.
But again, let's be clear about what we're talking about here, because in a pure non-Adam Smith, but even more radically free trade approach, one wouldn't worry about these dependencies in a kind of pure economic model, right? But that's why,
as long as there's not barriers to entry, because it's one thing to buy oil from Russia. It's another thing to make it virtually illegal to produce it yourself, or buy it from other people.
But I'm even talking about so let's just say that the laws of economics were such that there was a single monopoly producer of main, kind of large airframe, planes, right? And it just happened to be that name your country, right? Either it's Airbus. Let's say Airbus is the place. Now again, they're our allies, so maybe it wouldn't be as pernicious, but if the kind of normal working out of
China.
the market meant that China was the best producer, lowest cost producer, it had a comparative advantage of producing these types of airframes, it would still be valuable, a la Adam Smith, for us to domestically produce those, because we don't want to have a dangerous dependency on things that relate to security. And I think that's probably a difference between those who are, I think, Smithians in the matter, and those who are kind of ignoring the realities of the nation state system that actually exists today. Whether it's justified or not, it exists, and it's a constraint that we have to deal with. And again, as a realist, these constraints are things that I think have to be inputs into our model about how to approach our grand strategy. Like, I mean, on the other end of it, a constraint like nationalism means that if we have these grand plans to democratize a place, the people that we are trying to democratize might not appreciate that.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I'm a feminist in the sense that I think that, women can make great contributions to the world. We would be horribly misguided, not to have 50% of the species contributing as they see fit maximally in our economy. But we forget sometimes that the other side doesn't always agree with those things. And so when we try to do these things in another place, even for their own good, as we see it, there's a kind of constraint of nationalism and of their own self-interest that pushes back against that. And we have to acknowledge that as a constraint. Mm-hmm. And the problem of a kind of liberal idealism about foreign policy is that it tries to wish away these constraints of nationalism, of the balance of power, of the nuclear revolution, and this is why I kind of have an instinctual rejection of a kind of totalizing theory of cosmopolitan libertarianism, because we live in a world that unfortunately states are major players, or in some cases unfortunately, and so their interests, their advantages, the constraints we face, these all play into a very dangerous brew if we don't consider them. And that's essentially the story of American foreign policy over the last 30 years, isn't it? Is a kind of hubris about our ability to overcome constraints, and then the enemy and the adversary in the world getting a vote and voting quite differently.
Yeah.
And us getting bloody noses over it.
If you've made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we create at Free the People. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. So, as a realist, I'm going to challenge your realism because you're talking about China having a monopoly on military planes.
If it did, it was.
If it did, it's strictly hypothetical.
Yeah.
And I immediately started thinking about the Jones Act as a student of public choice policy, and of course, the Jones Act was passed right after World War I, right before World War I, to make sure that Americans had American-made ships.
Right.
And it's still there. It serves absolutely no purpose except to feed the special interests that were created by that good, and let's say it was a good. I don't know if it was a good intention policy. Right. It might have been special interest.
But even assuming it was, right.
The challenge with realism is that the built-in inevitable failures of political decision making. It's not driven by what's right or wrong. It's not necessarily driven by what works and what doesn't. It's driven by special interest politics that create things like never-ending wars.
Yeah. So what I would say is that you should always reach for your figurative or literal holster when people are making the claim that our national security demands.
Yeah.
Right. And I say that as a realist who sometimes believe our national security demands. Right. So, for example, I'm a pretty free speech absolutist, but I don't think the idea of like newspaper publishing troop movements during war would probably be, a great thing. The question is how you deal with it. But again, and when it comes to something like the Jones Act, look, people try to use national security justifications for their particular interests, and we ought to be extremely wary of those. And that's why we should demand...
They're sort of airdropped into almost every argument.
Right. And we should demand that people show their math, so to speak.
Yeah.
So on something like the Jones Act, which is it's harmful to America. It's not good for us. And we should be wary of those types of things. Demand that people tell us, okay, explain exactly how it actually tiers up to our security.
Yeah.
But that's the same thing when it comes to, say, Ukraine or in the 90s, the Balkans, or in the 2000s, all these, wars we fought. And again, I think that some wars are necessary to fight. America has had very few it needed to fight. The Iraq War is obviously one that isn't, but you heard people up and down, threat inflation, our security demands. And then, one of the first casualties of war, or preparing for war, or making the case for war is oftentimes the truth. And so you heard people talking about, well, there was a secret meeting in Prague between Al-Qaeda and the Iraqi government. Yeah, right. And we ought to be extremely skeptical of that. But I don't think that's inconsistent with realism, right? A realist is more than happy to try to show his math about why something is necessary from a security standpoint, especially because if you're making arguments that are not consistent with our security but are actually for pecuniary interests, you're actually undermining your prosperity and your ultimately your security by doing that. And so bad economic ideas, even under the guise of national security, are still bad, and realists should reject them. And fortunately, economics as a science can help us better understand what are the good economic arguments and the bad ones. And I was actually heartened several years ago, speaking of this, is when Admiral Mike Mullen, who is at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? And he was asked, what's our biggest security threat? And I feel like I kind of failed. I've been studying this my whole life, and I would have given a less good answer than him. I mean, I might have said something like, well, there's a lot of threat inflation in the world, and we shouldn't get, too exercised. But if you're asking me to rank order threats, even if they're not as big as other people think, here's what I would think they would be. Like, look, terrorism is still a threat. It's not something that we should change, our whole domestic society on. But yeah, we ought to be careful about that. And I think we should use special operations forces to go after terrorist groups that have an intent and a capability to harm us. And then I might have said China because it's a long-term strategic adversary. But Mike Mullen gave a better answer. What he said is our greatest national security threat are debt and deficits.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, stumped, right?
That's
a fantastic answer.
Every Tea Party activist I knew, including myself, would quote General Mullen on this because Admiral.
Yeah.
And because we were in the midst of this fight. You remember at the height of the Tea Party, there was this mechanism by which Republicans had nominally agreed to trim defense spending, and Democrats had nominally agreed to trim domestic spending.
A positive log roll.
And and this was unusual, right? And turns out it was extremely unsustainable because Tea Party Republicans, with a few important exceptions, ultimately caved to the idea that we needed to fully fund the wars.
Right.
And of course, wars are a black hole. And particularly if you want to fund the war on terror, that's a money pit that never ends. So it was the Achilles heel of this entire movement to be fiscally responsible and to meet that what Admiral Mullen said, that like if we want to be safe and we want to be secure and we want to be strong as a nation, we better get our fiscal house in order.
Absolutely.
So I feel like and again, I'm sliding into, I think, very realist arguments that would go back to Washington about not spending money you don't have on wars that you can't afford.
And that aren't necessary.
And oh, by the way, you're going to make the world less safe if you do that. And this kind of goes into your tradition at AIER, because how do we finance unnecessary wars? We print money.
Exactly.
Well, we borrow money.
Yes.
And then when we can't borrow any more money, we start asking the Treasury to help us out.
Yeah, and we ultimately undermine our own strength. And that's what I found so great about Admiral Mullen's comment there, is he hit the nail on the head, right? If you want to conform to a kind of higher realism, you need to make sure you have an economy that can support at a relatively low percentage of GDP your safety. Now, I hate the idea of having defense spending correspond to our percentage of GDP. It's a terrible idea. Remember 4% for freedom? Mm-hmm. That was a bad idea, because the way you should approach defense spending is, okay, what are the ends of our state, right? What do we need to do? And I would argue there's three kind of primary ends, right? It's our territorial integrity, right? Our safety here at home. It's the conditions of our prosperity, not the prosperity itself, right? Government shouldn't be spending, shouldn't be making sure everyone's wealthy. It's not even possible, right? But the conditions of our prosperity, right? Keeping sea lanes open, making sure that our satellites in space are safe, right? Those are the kind of conditions. Making sure that strategic choke points are open for our trade, right? Those are conditions of our prosperity. And then thirdly, our liberal democratic system here at home, right? We ought to one of our key national interests is to make sure that we, for example, don't lose sight of the fact that the reason why we have security is because it's in the service of the liberal polity that we want to live within, that we think is just. And so that means, for example, that one of the dangers of having a kind of security surveillance state in the name of safety is that you actually undermine liberal democracy in many ways. So again, those are the three kind of primary interests. And then you say, okay, what's the nature of the world? What's the nature of the constraints? What's the nature of the threat environment? And then what are the types of means that we can employ consistent, with the trade-offs we have to make about making sure we don't steal all, kind of kill the golden goose. How do we how do we create security, knowing that absolute security is impossible, right? That's the kind of mature way of doing it. Not saying like, oh, we should spend every year 4% of GDP on national defense because that's some kind of golden rule. And they would argue back saying like, no, it's just to make sure that we're not underspending. And 4%, if you look historically, we could afford that. No, like,
But by the way, it's almost sounding good right now, like to get back to something that ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, again, like there are good reasons for rules, like in monetary policy, like the Taylor rule is better than discretion. But look, in national defense spending, we don't want to make a budget outside of the reality.
It doesn't make sense to set that kind of a rule, but
and you also know you're going to break it if you actually want to, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem with these rules.
Yeah.
Like, we fight the Iraq War and it goes sour, and we're going to throw out some of the old rules.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love Liberty and look cool. So I'm going to hit you with a hot take thing. So you retweeted, this was one of the most shocking things that I've read on Twitter in a while, and that's saying something. Mm-hmm. But you said something about a tweet from our good friend David Frum. Who
thinks we're unpatriotic conservatives.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. You're what's the worst thing he calls us? Putin stooges, I guess, is what he called Rand Paul.
Yeah,
for asking for some sort of accountability on the zillions of dollars we were sending over there. But anyway, the context, and everyone knows this story, but Elon Musk has been providing basically free internet coverage through Starlink. I think that's what it is, for quite some time now. And he had the audacity to suggest that World War III and nuclear winter was a bad idea. And some Ukrainian official told him to go F himself. And he tweeted out, I can't afford to do this for free anymore. Someone's got to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And David Frum says, it was always unreasonable and is becoming unwise to expect Elon Musk to provide internet to Ukraine for free forever. Western allies should pay. And the U.S. should have a plan ready to nationalize Starlink fast if Musk cuts off Ukraine's connection to advance his political agenda. So that to me was sort of neoconservatism in a nutshell, because you could always come up with a rationale, a national security rationale, to steal somebody's company and to nationalize some industry. And I think that's a cautionary tale for how far they're willing to go in the name of this grandiose vision they have for reorganizing the world.
Right. And my response to things like this always is like, it's almost like, you destroy liberalism to save it, because they ostensibly are making some of the case. And again, they're throwing a lot of things on the wall to see what sticks to defend this approach to Ukraine. But ostensibly, some part of it for a guy like David Frum is that this is a Manichaean struggle between liberalism and the forces of evil. And I think you could accept the fact that Putin's Russia is not our cup of tea. It is not consistent with the classical liberalism that you and I share. But that doesn't mean that all means are on the table, particularly given that the administration has already said that this doesn't implicate vital national security interests. I mean, if this deeply implicated vital national security interests, probably David Frum thinks they are, then we should be thinking more seriously about entering the war formally and have troops on the ground.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately, the case is that Ukraine does not implicate. The Biden administration is correct about this. But if it doesn't implicate vital national interest, we shouldn't even be thinking about the idea of nationalizing companies for such a struggle. I mean, it's not even necessarily smart to nationalize countries when you do have vital national interests implicated, right? Particularly if you care about what I said before, which is our third national interest is our liberal democratic system here at home. We don't want to, kind of burn the village to save the village.
Right.
And but look, this is a great thing, especially to keep our energy up here at the end of the day, is to bring up David Frum and neoconservatives, right? I mean, look, the slanders that they have trotted out against people who love their country, like Senator Paul. I have no doubt about his love of country. And yet people like Frum and Liz Cheney and others are always wanting to question his patriotism and question the patriotism of anyone who wants to do anything less than they want to do in the world, oftentimes for an agenda that is largely other-regarding as opposed to self-regarding, meaning it may be about altruism as opposed to America's national interests, and yet somehow the cries of being a traitor or being a stooge for another regime are launched against the people who have America's national interests first, second, and third in their preference order. It's absurd. These people should. I mean, I'm not a believer in engaging in private coercion. But one could be forgiven for thinking that when people call others traitors, that some of those old-fashioned martial virtues of like let's take it outside might be more appropriate. I mean, if you're calling out people as traitors, and not only that, it's serious slander for people. To say that, and it's tossed around like crazy. But what about people in the armed forces like myself? I mean, I oppose the United States getting into a war with Russia over Ukraine. I think we're spending way too much money on Ukraine, given the lack of vital national interests that are implicated here. And yet, I'm a patriotic American. I love our country. I put our interests first, second, and third. And if people want to, and people use these, say these things, it's absurd, right? And it should not be tolerated in honestly in polite society. And so when David Frum talked about unpatriotic conservatives back in his famous piece he wrote around the time of the Iraq War when he was shilling for that, he should have been called out even by people on that side and say, look, that's way too far. You could have a different conception of the national interest and what's demanded without being considered to be, a traitor. It irritates me to no end, Matt, as you could probably tell.
I knew it would, which is why I brought it up.
Yeah, but again, what I find so ironic about it is that the people making these cases, you could try to slander them by saying that they're too nationalistic. Mm-hmm. That might be fine. You might say you're too focused on American national interests. You put them first, second, and third. What about other regarding interests, or what about liberalism? Like, why don't you care about the state of liberalism in the Donbass? I mean, I do. I would love to see the Donbass to be more liberal, and but that's not in the cards. But nor do I think when we're counseling the state. Should we counsel them to do things even in the service of our ideals that might actually be harmful? Because I do think that the national interest has moral dignity. And part of that is because I'm admittedly a statist classical liberal in the sense that I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I think that a limited government that serves to protect our safety and security is justified in classical liberal political philosophy. I think there's a good reason to have a police department and a court system and a national. Call me crazy, right? But given that, I think we have to be able to make the case that
you're on the very fringe of people I allow on my show.
Yeah, sorry. No, but again, I think we have to. I mean, there's a question about subsidiarity, who ought to be the right locus of that, and I'm more than happy to see buildings have private security to defend their buildings that puts less of a strain on the public coffers. But I think that there is a role for a minimal government. Nozick thought that. I know he's a crazy statist too. But Nozick, Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, right? Like the Hall of Fame of classical liberals agree with this. And again, it's a good argument to have with the David Friedmans of the world.
These are great arguments to have because we're all headed in the same direction because we're so far afield of any of those goals of limited government or
and that's why we have to be so
cooperation.
skeptical of the claims that are oftentimes made. But again, for me, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I do think that the national interest has moral dignity, right? We need to defend these basic interests because those are the conditions under which liberalism can prosper, and we can prosper, right? And so again, I think Admiral Mullen was kind of hitting on that, right? We need, going back to kind of AIER, and one of our big things is kind of economic freedom and monetary economics.
Yeah, I actually want to pivot to that
but that's important for getting the there's a if you're Ukraine and you're being invaded by Russia, it's a lot harder to think about economic freedom. Right. And I think this proves the point I'm trying to make, which is, sure, we should argue against rampant statism. But I think a classical liberal understands there's a role for this. And then we have to be deeply, deeply skeptical about infringements on our freedoms that are used under that rubric or others here at home. And maybe that's the good kind of pivot to the freedom agenda, I believe.
I think there's, I guess we'll call them consequentialist implications of freedom and free markets that really matter when it comes to loving your country and hoping that it's strong if it ever does get invaded, if it ever does get attacked.
Right.
You better be a free market economy. Otherwise, you don't have the strength to defend that. And that's really the basis of what AIER does is really focusing on how to make a strong economy and particularly how to keep our money from being corrupted by government. That was sort of the tradition of Colonel Harwood.
Yeah, exactly. And, we engage in research and educational programs related to individual liberty, free markets, sound money, limited government, property rights, right? These are the kind of core things that we believe in. So we focus largely on kind of three buckets right now at AIER. So one is monetary economics. We've been doing this since 1933. We've cared about the devaluement of our money, and we believe that one of the biggest problems out there is discretion of monetary authorities. Either influenced by bad ideas or by politics. These are essentially eroding our hard-earned wealth. And we forget sometimes that but the world forgets that inflation is something that is caused not by something out of the ether, but is largely caused by poor monetary policy, largely because people fashion themselves to use discretion to want to fine-tune things as they see fit, consistent with their preferences or the preferences of government. And this leads to all kinds of problems traditionally, and that's why we favor a more sound money approach. But then the second bucket is our economic freedom, right? And this is a very traditional thing that classical liberal think tanks work on, and we do too, looking at fiscal policy, regulatory policy. And we try to use the tools of economics, whether it's price theory, Austrian economics, public choice theory, to try to use those as engines of analysis to analyze these things. And then our third is our newest area, which is we calling defending freedom and combating collectivism. And this is an area where we're looking at some substantial threats to freedom in our country today. And we want to make sure that we're not missing those because they do relate to our economy and to economic freedom, right? If you get ESG wrong, that's going to destroy the kind of engine of economic growth that we have in our country, which is the kind of private enterprise system. So we're going after ESG and trying to defend the old-fashioned shareholder theory of people like Milton Friedman. We're also going after DEI, CRT, kind of critical race, Marxism, and trying to promote the kind of individualism that's at the heart of classical liberalism. We also we're very worried not just about these things that have largely been products of the left, but some of the rising collectivism we've seen on the right. So looking at the economic nationalism of the Catholic integralists and national conservatives. And we want to push back against that because economic nationalism and the way they're talking about it is not healthy. I mean, I was at this ISI conference and they had Lighthizer speak, and I swear this was the most economically illiterate speech I've ever heard in this town. And this is a town in which there's a lot of economic illiteracy, as you well know, right? You've been here a long time. This is this is not exactly the University of Chicago economics department in 1935 or something, right? A lot of economic illiteracy, and he was it was the most economically illiterate. I mean, he even at one point, I mean, I guess he got the economics right in some sense, but he said, yeah, rising prices are good because we'll consume less. I mean, I guess he got the economics right. It's true. But why would we want that, right? What is this going to mean? I mean, this is going to mean economic, struggle, not economic prosperity. And yet you hear this. And so I think that we really need to push back against that. And so we've hired Sam Gregg, who used to work at the Acton Institute, a great institution, but we were really excited to have him to kind of head this up. And he's got a new book out.
Yeah, what's the new book? I'm going to try to get him on sometime.
Yeah, you ought to. I mean, a big part of it is looking at the American economy today. And what's great about Sam is he knows his economics, but he also understands moral philosophy.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that AIER is trying to bring to the table, right? Is bringing together good economic understanding, right? Using the engines of analysis that economics provides, but marrying that to an understanding of history, an understanding of moral philosophy, especially the classical liberal tradition, to make the best cases, a positive case for freedom, and trying to knock down these arguments that are bad for us, both economically and in terms of our moral dignity as free individuals.
Yeah, and so my audience knows Phil Magnus pretty well.
Oh, Phil's great.
And I've had Dr. Jay Bhattacharya on the show several times, and it was before your time, but AIR is also famous or notorious, depending on who you ask. I think famous for the Great Barrington Declaration and sticking your necks out when few would. So people know that. Where can people find you and AIER?
So I'm somewhat active on Twitter at Will Ruger. And then for AIER, our website, aier.org, at AIER on Twitter. It's a great place they can go. And we like to make sure that we're providing fresh content on a regular basis that springs from our understanding of economics and freedom. So I would recommend you go there. But also, we want to engage even beyond our own kind of closest brothers and sisters, if you will. Right? We're trying to get out there to spread the message of freedom and good economics broader than that. And so our scholars are really active trying to get out there into the mainstream press to the extent to which it's friendly to it. So my colleague Phil Magnus, for example, has had a couple of great pieces in the Wall Street Journal, one on Piketty's bad data on inequality or on the issue of equity. As well as on this definition of a recession. I mean, people keep talking about how we might have a recession next year. I mean, look, Phil makes the case that, look, by the definitions that we usually use, we're already in a recession. What are we talking about? I mean, I guess there will only be a recession after the elections if Republicans win.
Sure.
I think that's probably what's happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, we're trying to be pretty active. One thing I think that's important, though, that I talk about combating collectivism. And we've talked a lot defensively about the problems of those who we disagree with. But I think we also need to be making a kind of positive case for why freedom, why business, why free enterprise, why sound money. And I know you agree with me on this, right? And that's because the vision of the world that I think a proper classical liberalism promotes is a great one for humanity, right?
Yeah.
And I don't mean in the kind of strictly consequentialist way that, of it makes us wealthier. That shouldn't be looked down upon, right? When people talk about we want less consumption like Lighthizer, he's talking about the possibility of less baby formula potentially, right? Less, fewer medical devices that can save us, but even fewer things that just might make us happier in terms of look, you got a whole bunch of albums here. I'm sure that having a great Pink Floyd album on vinyl probably gives you some cheer.
It's objectively valuable.
Yeah, exactly. In that case, yeah. Or any prog rock in my book. But,
I'm usually a subjectivist, and we've talked about this quite a bit. The idea that the way to sell freedom in the market and the ability of people to cooperate and create things and produce things is ultimately about happiness and dignity. And
that's where I was going to kind of go with going beyond just the stuff.
yeah,
Because I think that if we adopt a crass consumerism, I think that's rife for critique, right? Because again, like I think you can believe in the truism that people value things differently, right? That's behind subjectivism without having a kind of moral relativism.
right.
But I think the key thing for the positive case for freedom is that it is consistent with respecting the moral dignity of all individuals, which is, I think, at the heart of what classical liberalism mean, and is consistent with a lot of other types of isms.
Right.
And I think that's what's so beautiful about it, is that freedom allows people to be vicious, but it also allows them to be virtuous, to kind of paraphrase Frank Meyer. We can realize our best self if we're free, in my view. And I think that a system that disrespects you so much as to believe that people in Washington or even in state capitals should tell you how to live your life beyond the basics of respecting the law of equal freedom, right? I don't have a problem if I try to swing my fist wildly that the long arm of the law will stop that, or that others will use self-defense to prevent it. Even better, right? Or even more subsidiarist. But the idea that other people should try to tell you how to live is so disrespectful of our moral dignity, and that's ultimately why we should reject it, right? Even though, of course, we ought to also reject it because it leads us to be less prosperous. But ultimately, I think we care about our flourishing more broadly, and freedom is such an important condition for us realizing that. And I think that that's the case we need to make better, about why state control is harming our flourishing, and in that broader, deeper sense. Because otherwise we, again, fall prey to you just support free trade because you can get cheap doodads at Walmart made in China, and how is that good? Well, I think you can make the case for why that's better than the alternative, but I think that we want to be able to say that there's something deeper that freedom corresponds with, in kind of our the essence of what it means to be a human. And that's a case we need to make, because those who disagree with us oftentimes will couch their arguments that their way of engaging in politics is actually more in correspondence with our flourishing. And I think we reject that, especially when it comes to issues of like virtue, because I fully agree with Frank Meyer that sure, we could be habituated or coerced to act in a certain way, but that's not truly being a virtuous man or woman. And so if that's what you care about, you ought to double down on freedom, within the bounds of the law of equal freedom.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so
you.
much. Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.